Japan's surrender and the demand for justice. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world was left staring at the smoldering ruins of Japan. 2 atomic bombs had obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki cities, reduced to ash in a matter of seconds, and the Japanese Empire, once feared across Asia and the Pacific, was forced to admit defeat. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito made his historic radio broadcast telling the Japanese people that the war must end. His words were calm, but they carried the weight of devastation: millions dead, cities burned, and a nation humiliated. But even as Japan surrendered, the Allied powers were not prepared to simply close the book. The world had seen atrocities on an unimaginable scale: massacres of civilians, torture of prisoners of war, human experimentation, and campaigns of brutality that rivaled even the horrors of Nazi Germany. Justice was demanded, not only for the soldiers who suffered in battle, but also for the millions of innocent men, women, and children across China, Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, who had endured the Japanese military's iron fist. The trials that followed would forever be known as the Tokyo Trials, or officially the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Convened in May 1946 and lasting until 1948, this massive legal undertaking aimed to hold Japan's top military and political leaders accountable for Class A war crimes, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. 28 men were put on trial, the architects of Japan's imperial expansion and wartime brutality. They were the highest-ranking military officers, politicians, and strategists who had shaped Japan's war path. Names like General Hideki Tojo, the infamous wartime prime minister, stood out immediately. Tojo was regarded as the Japanese counterpart to Hitler or Mussolini, a man whose decisions directly fueled the attack on Pearl Harbor and the invasions that consumed Asia. Alongside him were generals, admirals, diplomats, and bureaucrats, all accused of dragging Japan into a war of aggression and sanctioning acts of savagery. The courtroom was tense, filled with survivors' testimonies and stacks of evidence. Orders signed by leaders, reports of massacres like Nanjing, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were slaughtered, and accounts of prisoners forced into slave labor or medical experiments by units such as the infamous Unit 731. Witness after witness painted a horrifying picture of Japan's wartime machine. For the first time, the Japanese public was forced to hear stories of atrocities committed in their name. For many of the accused, denial became their shield. Some claimed they were simply following orders, others insisted they had no knowledge of the full extent of the atrocities. But the prosecution was relentless. Hideki Tojo, once the confident face of Japan's militarism, sat in the dock, reduced to a frail, defeated man, listening as his name was tied again and again to the suffering of millions. The symbolism of the trials was massive. Just as in Nuremberg, where Nazi leaders faced justice, Tokyo became a stage where the world declared that leaders could not hide behind flags, thrones, or uniforms. War crimes were not simply the acts of faceless soldiers in the field. They were the product of decisions made in high offices, boardrooms, and palaces. The Tokyo trials were a direct challenge to the old idea that victors write history. This was not just about victory. It was about accountability. As weeks turned into months, the trials captured the attention of the world. Some Japanese people resented them, viewing the tribunal as victors' justice imposed by the Allies. But for the millions across Asia who had lived through Japan's occupation, the trials were not symbolic. They were deeply personal. They were a chance to see the powerful men responsible for their suffering finally face consequences. By the end of the tribunal, sentences would be passed, and the fates of these leaders would be sealed. Some would face death by hanging, their final moments carried out in silence behind prison walls. Others would spend the rest of their lives in prison, stripped of their once mighty power. and in those punishments lay the brutal end of Japan's war leadership, a reckoning that changed how the world viewed responsibility in war. The war had ended, but for the leaders of Imperial Japan, the reckoning was only beginning. The trial and fate of Hideki Tojo. Among the 28 men who sat in the dock at the Tokyo trials, none carried more symbolic weight than General Hideki Tojo, Japan's wartime prime minister. Tojo was the face of Imperial Japan's aggression, a man who had personally overseen the expansion of war across Asia and the Pacific. His iron-jawed features, stern glasses, and military uniform had once represented absolute authority to his people. By 1941, he was not just prime minister. He was also war minister, interior minister, and later even chief of the Army General Staff. Few leaders concentrated so much power in their hands. It was Tojo who approved the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, dragging the United States into war. Under his command, Japanese forces overran territories across Southeast Asia, committing atrocities along the way. Tojo's government approved the harsh occupation of the Philippines, where civilians endured massacres and famine. He was linked to the forced labor system that exploited millions from Korea and China, and his leadership provided cover for the infamous Unit 731, which carried out grotesque biological experiments on living humans. By the end of the war, Tojo was widely despised outside Japan and regarded as one of the key villains of World War II. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Allies made it clear Tojo would stand trial as a Class A war criminal. But before they could bring him to justice, Tojo attempted to escape his fate in a dramatic and almost cinematic way. On September 11, 1945, as American soldiers arrived to arrest him at his Tokyo residence, Tojo drew a pistol and shot himself in the chest. However, he failed to die. The bullet missed his heart, passing through his stomach. American military doctors rushed to treat him, and in a twist of irony, the very men he had once sought to destroy saved his life. He would live, but only long enough to face judgment. At the Tokyo trials, Tojo sat stoically in the dock, often taking notes and rarely showing emotion. The charges against him were overwhelming. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind who had plunged the Pacific into chaos. They accused him of authorizing wars of aggression, sanctioning brutal treatment of prisoners, and overseeing policies that led directly to mass starvation and death in occupied lands. Tojo, however, did not shrink away from responsibility. In fact, he surprised many by openly accepting blame for Japan's entry into war. During testimony, he declared that as prime minister, he had ultimate responsibility for the decisions of his cabinet and military. He admitted that attacking Pearl Harbor was his choice, and he expressed regret for the suffering that the war had caused. Some observers believed this was a final attempt to preserve honor, even as he knew his fate was sealed. Still, his admission did not absolve him. The tribunal found him guilty of multiple counts, including initiating aggressive war, violating international treaties, and committing atrocities against civilians and prisoners. The judges representing 11 Allied nations sentenced Tojo to death. On December 23, 1948, Hideki Tojo was led to the gallows inside Sugamo prison in Tokyo. Dressed in white robes, he remained calm, bowing to the guards and speaking his last words in a firm voice. Reports say he expressed hope that Japan would learn from its mistakes and rebuild as a peaceful nation. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the trapdoor opened, and the once powerful prime minister met his end. For many around the world, Tojo's execution was the ultimate symbol of justice delivered. Here was the man who had stood toe-to-toe with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek on the battlefield of history, brought down not by bombs or bullets, but by a rope. Tojo's fate also served as a warning to future leaders. Starting a war of aggression could one day end not in glory, but in disgrace. Yet inside Japan, his death stirred complicated feelings. Some nationalists viewed him as a scapegoat, punished to satisfy the Allies while Emperor Hirohito remained untouched. Others, particularly the families who had lost sons in battle, felt no sympathy. To them, Tojo had led their loved ones to slaughter. The brutal end of Hideki Tojo was only the beginning. Other Japanese leaders, generals, admirals, and officials, were also facing their judgment. Some would hang alongside Tojo, their names forever tied to war crimes that horrified the world. The generals who paid the ultimate price. If Hideki Tojo symbolized Japan's political and military aggression, several other men represented the ruthless brutality carried out on the ground. These were the generals whose armies marched into foreign lands, leaving behind scars of massacres, forced labor, and human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. When the Tokyo trials concluded, a number of these generals joined Tojo on the gallows. Their deaths marked the collapse of Japan's once proud warrior class, ending not with battlefield glory, but with the disgrace of war crimes. General Iwane Matsui, the butcher of Nanjing, perhaps no name from Japan's military leadership, is more reviled than General Iwane Matsui, the commander responsible for the infamous Nanjing massacre. In December 1937, Japanese troops under his command stormed the Chinese capital of Nanjing. What followed remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Over the course of 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers carried out a spree of killing, looting, and sexual violence on a staggering scale. Civilians were rounded up and executed in mass shootings. Estimates suggest that 200,000 to 300,000 people were killed and at least 20,000 women were raped. Even children and the elderly were not spared. Bodies floated in the Yangtze River, while entire neighborhoods were burned to the ground. Though Matsui did not personally pull the trigger, he bore full responsibility as commander. At the Tokyo trials, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors testified to the horrors, and photographs taken by foreign journalists documented the atrocities. Matsui attempted to argue that he had lost control of his troops, but the judges ruled that he had not only failed to stop the massacre, but had also tolerated it. For this he was sentenced to death. On December 23, 1948, Matsui was hanged alongside Tojo. To many in China, his execution was a long-awaited justice for the bloodshed in Nanjing. His name remains synonymous with cruelty, forever tied to one of history's worst war crimes. General Kenji Doihara, the Manipulator, where Matsui represented brute force, General Kenji Doihara embodied the cunning manipulation of imperial expansion. Known as the Lawrence of Manchuria, Doihara was a master of espionage and psychological warfare. He orchestrated the Mukden Incident of 1931, a staged attack on a Japanese railway that served as a pretext for Japan's invasion of Manchuria. That false flag operation gave birth to the puppet state of Manchukuo, a cornerstone of Japanese imperialism in China. Doihara's cruelty did not stop at deception. He was directly involved in setting up forced labor systems and encouraging the opium trade in occupied territories, deliberately flooding Chinese communities with addiction to weaken resistance. His policies contributed to the suffering of millions. At the Tokyo trials, Doihara was portrayed as one of the intellectual architects of Japanese aggression. Unlike some generals who relied purely on violence, Doihara combined military power with covert operations, propaganda, and criminal exploitation. His sentence was death by hanging, a punishment many viewed as fitting for the man who manipulated entire regions into submission. Other generals at the gallows. Several other military leaders also faced execution. General Saishiro Itagaki, who helped orchestrate Japan's invasion of China, was condemned for aggressive war. General Akira Muto, who had overseen atrocities in the Philippines, faced trial for the Manila Massacre of 1945, when Japanese forces killed over 100,000 civilians in one of the last major war crimes of the Pacific War. One by one, these generals, who once commanded vast armies, stood in silence as they were led to the noose. For men raised in a culture where dying on the battlefield was the highest honor to meet their end, in a prison execution chamber was the ultimate humiliation. They were not remembered as noble warriors, but as criminals whose names became curses in the lands they once occupied. The executions of Matsui, Doihara, and others sent a chilling message across the globe. Military rank and battlefield victories could not shield leaders from accountability. The very generals who once dreamed of conquering Asia were reduced to convicted war criminals, their legacies drowned in blood. But not all Japanese leaders met the rope. Some faced life imprisonment, instead their punishment dragging on for decades behind bars. For these men the brutal end came not quickly, but slowly, with every passing year of confinement serving as a reminder of their crimes. Life imprisonment for Japan's war leaders. While 7 of Japan's wartime leaders, including Hideki Tojo and General Matsui, met their end at the gallows, not every man in the dock was condemned to death. For several of the accused, the tribunal chose life imprisonment, a punishment that carried its own grim weight. Instead of a swift end, these men were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind the cold walls of Sugamo prison. It was a slower, quieter form of justice, where power, wealth, and prestige meant nothing. The men who once commanded armies, drafted policies, and ruled nations now had only iron bars and silence as their companions. Koki Hirota, the diplomat turned war criminal, one of the most striking figures to receive a heavy sentence, was Koki Hirota, a civilian diplomat who had briefly served as Japan's prime minister before the war. Unlike the generals, Hirota was not a battlefield commander. Instead, his crimes stemmed from his complicity in enabling Japan's aggression through politics and diplomacy. Hirota was accused of failing to prevent the atrocities committed in China, particularly the Nanjing massacre, even though he was in a position to do so. Witnesses and documents revealed that Hirota knew about the mass killings and rapes, yet he chose not to act. At the trial, prosecutors described his silence as a form of approval. Though Hirota was not a soldier, the tribunal concluded that his role in shaping policy and his willful negligence warranted the ultimate punishment. He became the only civilian among the Tokyo defendants to be executed. On December 23, 1948, he was hanged alongside Tojo and the generals. His death sent a chilling reminder that politicians and diplomats were just as accountable as men in uniform. Shigenori Togo, the reluctant minister, another figure. Shigenori Togo offered a very different image of Japanese leadership. Togo had been Japan's foreign minister at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Unlike Tojo, however, Togo had argued against war. Records revealed that he warned his fellow cabinet members about the dangers of provoking the United States and sought diplomatic alternatives. But in the end, Togo did not resign. He signed the documents, followed the decisions, and remained part of the system that carried out the attack. At the tribunal, he argued that his efforts to avoid war should spare him, but the judges concluded that his compliance made him complicit. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For Togo, this was a devastating blow. A man who had always seen himself as a reluctant participant now found himself behind bars, branded a war criminal. He served his sentence in Sugamo prison, but suffered from deteriorating health. In 1950, he was granted parole to seek medical treatment, only to die of cancer shortly afterward. His story illustrated the heavy price of silence and compromise, even for those who were not fanatical militarists. Other imprisoned leaders. Several other figures joined Togo in the slow punishment of lifelong imprisonment. Among them was Haitaro Kimura, a general involved in the infamous Burma Railway project, often remembered as the Death Railway. Under his oversight, Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers were forced to build a 415-kilometer railway under brutal conditions. Tens of thousands perished from starvation, disease, and abuse. Kimura was sentenced to death, but later commuted to life imprisonment, spending years in Sugamo before dying in captivity. Another was Kuniaki Koiso, a prime minister during the war who oversaw policies of occupation and forced conscription in Korea. Like the others, Koiso received life imprisonment and lived out his days in prison until his death in 1950. Then there was Yosuke Matsuoka, Japan's former foreign minister, who had been one of the architects of the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. Though he died before the tribunal reached its final verdict, his name remains forever tied to the empire's descent into alliance with fascist powers. Life inside Sugamo prison. For those sentenced to life, the daily reality was a cruel inversion of their past. Once accustomed to being saluted, obeyed, and feared, they now followed the orders of prison guards. Many of them young American soldiers barely out of their teens. Prisoners wore plain uniforms, ate simple meals, and lived in small cells. Conversations were limited, and the endless monotony of prison life gnawed at their spirits. Some sought comfort in religion. Hideki Tojo, before his execution, had converted to Buddhism, and others followed similar spiritual paths, hoping to make sense of their downfall. Others spent their time writing memoirs, reflecting on their careers, and in some cases still justifying their actions. Yet the punishment was clear. These men had gone from shaping the destiny of nations to fading away in obscurity behind locked doors. For them, life imprisonment was not just a sentence of confinement. It was a daily reminder of their lost power and the weight of their crimes. The gallows had claimed some, but the prison walls claimed the rest. Together, these punishments marked the total dismantling of Japan's wartime leadership. But one figure remained untouched, a man whose survival would shape Japan's post-war identity and spark controversy for decades: Emperor Hirohito. Emperor Hirohito's controversial escape from justice. When the Tokyo trials began, one question overshadowed all others. What about Emperor Hirohito? He was, after all, the living symbol of imperial Japan, the man worshipped as a divine being, the Son of Heaven, whose word was law for millions of loyal subjects. His image had been stamped on coins, flags, and propaganda. Japanese soldiers shouted his name when they charged into battle, and civilians bowed before his portraits. To the outside world, it seemed unthinkable that Hirohito could escape responsibility. Yet, when the judgments were handed down, the emperor was never even indicted. The emperor's role in the war. Historians have long debated just how much power Hirohito wielded during the war. Officially, he was a constitutional monarch whose government and generals made decisions in his name. But evidence suggests he was far from a passive figurehead. Records from wartime meetings show Hirohito being briefed regularly about military operations. He approved the attack on Pearl Harbor, authorized the invasion of China, and received detailed updates on the progress of battles. Even in Japan's darkest moments, Hirohito remained involved. In 1945, when Japan's leaders debated whether to surrender, the emperor personally intervened in the so-called Imperial Conference, siding with those who wanted peace after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This intervention showed that when he chose to act, Hirohito's voice carried decisive weight. So why, then, was he never tried as a war criminal? The American dilemma. The answer lay in politics and strategy. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Japan, faced a monumental task: rebuilding a shattered nation while preventing chaos and rebellion. Japan had been devastated by war, its cities reduced to rubble, its people starving, and its government collapsed. MacArthur and his advisors believed that punishing Hirohito would destabilize the fragile country, possibly sparking uprisings or even civil war. Instead, MacArthur decided to protect the emperor and use him as a unifying symbol for post-war reconstruction. By keeping Hirohito on the throne, though stripped of divine status and political power, the Americans believed they could more easily guide Japan into a peaceful, democratic future. This decision meant shifting blame almost entirely onto Tojo, Matsui, Doihara, and other military leaders. Hirohito was recast not as an architect of war, but as a benevolent figure misled by his advisors. A carefully managed image. The Allies went to great lengths to preserve Hirohito's image. Photographs showed him visiting bombed-out cities, standing humbly in Western suits, rather than imperial robes, and even shaking hands with MacArthur in a now famous photo where the towering American general dwarfed the small emperor. These images were deliberate, meant to reshape him from a godlike figure into a human monarch who would cooperate with the Allies. During the trials, prosecutors avoided any direct accusations against the emperor. Defendants like Tojo even reinforced this narrative by taking responsibility themselves. When asked about Hirohito's involvement, Tojo insisted that the emperor had no choice but to approve cabinet decisions, effectively shielding him from blame. The controversy, this decision remains one of the most controversial legacies of the Tokyo trials. Many survivors of Japanese atrocities, especially in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, viewed Hirohito's exemption as a betrayal of justice. To them, the emperor was not just a symbolic figure, but the head of the empire that had brought devastation to their lands. Scholars continue to argue whether Hirohito should have stood trial alongside his generals. For some Japanese citizens, however, his survival was a relief. They had grown up worshipping him, and his retention on the throne helped ease the transition into a post-war world. Instead of seeing their country dissolved into chaos, they found continuity in the figure of Hirohito, albeit a redefined one. The emperor after the war. In the years that followed, Hirohito remained emperor, but his role was purely ceremonial. The new Japanese Constitution of 1947 stripped him of all political power, declaring him simply the symbol of the state and the unity of the people. He lived on quietly until his death in 1989, never facing trial, never imprisoned, and never directly apologizing for the war in the way many hoped. His escape from justice left a lasting scar on the memory of World War II. To some, he represented stability and survival for Japan. To others, he was the most guilty man of all, the one who gave his blessing to invasions, massacres, and suffering on an unimaginable scale, yet managed to avoid accountability. The brutal end of Japanese leaders had many faces: the gallows, the prison walls, and the shame of history. But for Emperor Hirohito, the end was different, a quiet survival that remains one of the greatest moral compromises of the post-war world, the legacy of their brutal end. The story of the Japanese leaders who faced execution after World War II does not end with the drop of the gallows trapdoor. Their brutal punishment left a legacy that still lingers in Japan and across the world today.